Uh, so, welcome once more. This actually will be the last online lecture in the series because we have now agreed that the remaining lectures on Foucault, there will be 3 more, we will do those in person. In many ways, that's a much more comfortable and I think more useful format and clearly much more familiar, at least for me. But we have scheduled this lecture on Levi-Strauss's The Savage Mind. We will do this online. So let me begin with the screen. Okay. Okay. Shobik, do we have this?
Yes, Partha.
Okay. So Claude Levi-Strauss mark his dates 1908 to 2009, which means he lived for 101 years. And it is said that even a few months before he died, he actually regularly went to his office in the Collège de France in Paris and met people there, studied there. So if for nothing else, that is one example that you can hold before you in terms of scholarly endeavor and perseverance. But of course, Levi-Strauss was remarkable for many, many more reasons. We will look at some of them. He studied and taught in Paris and is known as the founder of structural anthropology, the method of structuralism, which we will look at not in a great detail. We don't have the time for it, but at least we will, I will try to introduce you to the basic principles of structuralism generally and structural anthropology, which Levi-Strauss tried to practice. So among his many works, by the way, what is more important to note is that Levi-Strauss, once again, in line with people like Durkheim, we haven't read Marcel Mauss, but he was an important predecessor, and many others who are regarded as the founders of anthropology. Levi-Strauss too did not actually do a great deal of fieldwork. Unlike anthropology as it is practiced today or in recent decades, where the reputation of anthropologists is primarily on the basis of actual fieldwork done in particular settings, and it's ethnographic work done by oneself that primarily qualifies an anthropologist for, advanced professional recognition. But Levi-Strauss was still working in an older tradition, largely in an older tradition, where it was mainly on the basis of ethnographic work done by others. So it is by bringing together a very large corpus of both professional ethnography as well as ethnographic accounts by various officials, missionaries, even travelers, in different countries, people who went into strange places and met strange people and wrote down detailed descriptions of the sort of strange practices of so-called other peoples. And it's on the basis of, a large collection of those kinds of works that a lot of the early anthropologists, people like Fraser, Tyler, and so on, they produce their theory on larger explanatory frameworks about essentially the human, sometimes as Levi-Strauss himself would argue, the human mind, how people think, but more than that, about practices, social practices, from the most so-called primitive peoples, with very simple, supposedly very simple social organizations. And that's the kind of tradition in which Levi-Strauss also largely followed. The only field work he ever did was in Brazil in the 1930s twice. He went, and even then he did not stay at any one place for a long time. He essentially traveled around Brazil, and then a very small stay, short stay in Chittagong, which was then in East Pakistan in 1950. And those are the only ethnographic field trips that he ever made. In 1941, of course, Levi-Strauss was French, but Jewish, and so he had to escape France in 1941 when the Germans invaded France, and he came to New York, where he collaborated, and this was a very significant intellectual collaboration, with Roman Jakobson. Jakobson was a major figure in what is known as structural linguistics. And Jakobson was then, once again, he was an exiled in the US, and he had a significant influence on Levi-Strauss and largely shaped his ideas about the structural analysis of social structures, social formations, cultures, the structural analysis of culture, you might say, which would be structural anthropology. After his return to France, he published, and these are his main books, Elementary Structure of Kinship, which was the first significant structural analysis of kinship in general, all kinds of kinship relations in different sorts of society. And Triste Tropique, which was sort of written as a kind of travel account by Levi-Strauss, but this travel account has significant reflections on his understanding of different cultures and how and the kinds of commonalities among cultures. His basic argument that there is a single fundamental form in all human thinking, which affects all possible organizations of society, human society, everywhere. So that's also a very well-known book, published in 1955. And then he had 2 volumes of structural anthropology. These are separate studies. A lot of them were earlier published as single papers and then put together in these 2 volumes. And the 4-volume collection of mythologies, it's called Mythologies in the English translation. The French is not mythologie, but mythologique, which is a combination of myth and logic. And we will see why Levi-Strauss wanted to do this. It was not simply a traditional way of understanding myths, but to look at how myths were actually structured had a logical structure. So these are his main works. The particular book we are going to look at, called La Pensée Sauvage. Now, the title is interesting. It's published in 1962. Sorry. This is the original cover of the book. And the title actually means both savage thought. Pensée could mean thought, but it also means wild flowers. And as we will see, Levi-Strauss was very fond of using these puns and ironical uses, phrases, to mean more than one thing. So, what is structural anthropology broadly? The structural analysis of myths on the model of language. And this is important to understand. The framework of structural analysis originally arose in the field of linguistics, in the study of languages. And unlike the earlier understanding of what was called philology or comparative philology, which basically took specific languages and language families, what are called language families, and tried to establish relations, including historical relations about which language split into several dialects or several forms. For instance, the idea of the Romance languages, which all of Europe, for instance, French, Spanish, Italian, these are all Romance languages understood to be derived from Latin, which is the original form, right? Or let's say the famous understanding of the Indo-Aryan, the Indo-Aryan or Indo-European language family, which originally was proposed by William Jones, who, as you know, was an official in Bengal, and in fact is buried here or in the Park Street Cemetery. William Jones, who proposed that through his study of the similarities between Sanskrit and various European languages, that the European languages and Sanskrit were actually part of the same family of languages. Now, but the structural analysis of language actually tried to make the argument that it's not simply these historically developed connections, but there is something even more fundamental about all human languages, which is if they all share a certain basic structural characteristics, all human languages. And there were certain kinds of concepts which were developed. For instance, in the case of languages, the difference between what Saussure called langue and parole. Langue meaning, say, language, and parole or speech. And this is something we understand quite easily, that when people speak and we understand what that person is saying, it is not because we actually have encountered every single sentence that that person is saying before, and we have learned it. We don't learn the sentences as such, right? So, for instance, what I'm saying, clearly every sentence that I'm saying is not something you have heard previously and learned the meaning, and therefore you understand what I'm saying. That is not how we communicate. We communicate because we have a more fundamental understanding of language, of the language itself, right? And since we have that understanding, we can understand an infinite number of sentences that may be produced within that language, within the rules of that language, right? In other words, long is, or it actually defines the basic rules of a language. And that again is divided into what is called the lexical and the semantic. Lexical meaning what is in the dictionary, the words, right? So every language has these two dimensions, right? The set of words and what each of those words can mean in that language. But simply by knowing the words, you cannot produce meaningful sentences. You have to also know the ways in which those words can be combined meaningfully. And that is understood as syntactic or semantic, right? Grammar, as we will ordinarily, the way we learned it in school, the rules of grammar. And the interesting thing is, of course, that large numbers of people, millions of people who speak a language do not necessarily explicitly know the rules of the grammar of that language. Obviously, for instance, in a country like India, right? Most people, there was a time not very long ago when most people who spoke the language never went to school. And yet they were able to speak a language in an understandable way. And that is because, once again, the rules of grammar are simply implicit. Implicitly, people learn without being actually taught as rules in the way in which we would normally learn a foreign language. For instance, most of us would have learned English formally. That is to say, we have to take rules of grammar. We were usually taught in school what is the correct grammatical form of a sentence, how do you write them correctly, and you also learned the words. And very often you would come across words that you did not know, and you'd have to look in the dictionary to find out what that word means. That is the way in which people learn a language in the formal way. Most foreign languages would be learned that way. But what is called a native language or a mother tongue is very often learned from childhood, right? In this way, where people acquire the words and the meanings and the correct forms of syntactic combination implicitly, without ever being explicitly told what. So, for instance, most people, if you ask them what the rules are of the English language or the Bangla language or the Hindi language, right, which they probably speak ordinarily, they speak it fluently, but most people would not be able to tell what the rules are in terms of the grammar. So that is the kind of distinction. These are, of course, very basic fundamental distinctions. There are many, many more, much more complicated structural forms that structural linguistics would discover, which they would argue are common elements of structural elements of every human language. And every human language can be analyzed and therefore compared on the basis of those fundamental elements, structural elements. So that is structural linguistics. The key terms which we will encounter in even this very short chapter that we will read today, some of these key terms. So, for instance, one of the key concepts that Levi-Strauss would talk about is the concept of the sign, right? And of course, this here linguistics and what is a related field called semiotics. That is to say, the science of signs. How do you analyze signs? So there's a very basic definition where a sign, for instance, we all know the sign, which is a standard traffic sign, which is now universally used everywhere in the world. This sign, for someone, let us say someone coming into an urban area for the first time in his or her life, will probably definitely recognize the colors, know that these are three different colors which that person will recognize, but they would not be able to know what this particular arrangement of those three colors in this particular way actually signifies. What does it mean? What is the meaning it conveys, right? So in order for it to become a sign, you need two elements. You need the signifier and the signified. So a sign can be broken up into the signifier. In this case, the signifier are these three colors. Okay, in that particular arrangement. The arrangement is also important, as we know. And once it is put in that color, a person who recognizes the sign, in other words, understands, you might say, the language in which this sign is constructed, right, would also know what it signifies. So, for instance, when the red is lit up, we know this is where you stop. When the green is lit up, we know, well, we can move ahead, right? The yellow is a warning sign to say either now you must stop or now you can start, but it's the intervening sign. So you can do a similar analysis for a whole range of the hundreds of thousands of signs that surround us all the time. But this is a very basic way in which you analyze signs, by identifying the signifier and the signified. But be very careful to note that it's only just as simply by hearing the sound of words, you do not necessarily understand what it signifies or means, unless you know the language. That is to say, you must know the lexical meaning, the dictionary meaning of those words, and the grammatical meaning, right? Which is to say, what a particular combination of those words in a sentence would actually mean. You must, to be able to understand that, you must know the rules of that language, both the lexical and the semantic rules of that language. Similarly, to understand signs, you must know the signifier and the signified, how they are brought together within a particular, you might say, cultural context. This sign that you see on traffic junctions, right? All parts of the world. Now, obviously, there was a time when people would not have known, many people would not have known what this particular arrangement of the colored lights actually mean, right? You have to get familiar with it. It's like learning a language. So it is actually culturally embedded. Signs make meaning only within particular cultural contexts. Okay. Another important distinction is between metaphor and metonymy. Metaphor and metonymy. And metaphor and metonymy, we normally know what metaphor is. So, for instance, if someone said, well, very interesting words. So, for instance, think of the term mother, which of course we all know. Every culture, every language has a term for mother. But when you say Mother Nature, all right, or you say, you can hear this all the time, my country is like my mother. Okay, now these are metaphorical uses. Metaphorical uses. You are describing your country as like, similar to mother. Okay, so that is a metonymic use. But supposing you refer to Bharat Mata, Mother India. Now, that is not simply a metaphoric use, because then you are ascribing, so it is in place of. So in place of India, you can substitute mother. And you can see this in a large array of, literary, in songs, in paintings. So think of, you must have seen paintings of Bharat Mata where it's the map of India on which you have a goddess-like figure, right? And that is supposed to be Bharat Mata. So that is a metonymic use, in place of. So you are basically putting a part to stand in for the whole. And here, of course, when the metonymy works in this way, in the map, which is just a part, which you show, and it points to the mother figure, who is the goddess. You can then have a whole range of signifying manipulations of that image, the metonymic use of that image, because metonymy has this effect of a wide variety of multiplying uses, when you can put one in place of the other, or put that figure in arrangement with others, right? Where metonymically you produce a whole range of new meanings. Okay, so metaphor and metonymy are important ways, parts of this linguistic analysis, structural analysis of language. Lexical and syntactic I've already described. Synchrony and diachrony is another one which we will encounter, and it's a very major question in Levi-Strauss's method. Synchrony is a description of the different parts of a structure, the arrangement of different parts of a structure that occurs simultaneously at the same time. Synchrony literally means at the same time. Okay, so for instance, think of a clock, not your electronic clock or watch. Think of the old kind of clock, right, with hands, and you have a spring inside which is coiled. You have to wind that spring, right? And then synchronically, the spring, if the clock is properly structured, then that spring will uncoil or unwind in a particular way, so that the hands of the clock will move exactly as it is supposed to indicate the time that has elapsed, right? And then you get a clock. Now, that description, structural description of the working of the mechanisms of that clock would be a synchronous, right, description of that clock. Everything is working at the same time, right? That is a synchronic description of that clock. But then suppose over time, the clock begins to, as we would say, it's running slow or it's running fast, okay? It is still synchronous. It's still, there is a synchrony by which it is doing, but something has changed from its earlier synchronic state, which is the normal or the correct synchronic state, to when it is running slow, right? And usually it could be something like the spring no longer is tight enough, right? Over time, the spring has got loose, whatever. There is something that's happened over time. But this change, the original synchronic description of the structure of the clock, will not be able to explain what this changed structure is, right? how has this come about that the clock is running slow? Now, this is a diachronic description. We are contrasting between one point in the same structure at one point in time, comparing it to another point in time, and describing the change that has happened. And it's a question in all kinds of structural analysis, how to account for both of these things, to account for a synchronic description of a structure where all the parts are arranged arranged simultaneously at the same time, and how that structure may or may not change over time, which is the diachronic dimension, right? We will come to this later on because this is a very significant problem in Levi-Strauss's method of structural anthropology. Okay. So what is the main problem that Levi-Strauss is trying to address? He is trying to, first of all, show that myths of widely separated people often are very similar. Right? Widely separated people. There's no question of one culture being influenced by another culture and so on. They're completely separated people. And yet they seem to have the same or similar myths. Myths which have the same kind of structure. Levi-Strauss is using this observation to argue that there must be universal laws of myths, right? That myths, or these stories, which are mythical stories, have universal laws. In other words, the same structural forms. And here, the key binary opposition that Levi-Strauss works with, or in all of his works, is nature versus culture. Okay? Nature versus culture. One of the key claims that Levi-Strauss is making is that compared to all other living beings, right, who are part of nature, right, birds, animals, fishes, and so on, obviously plants, they are part of nature, they follow natural laws, right? Unlike all of those natural beings, living beings, humans are different because humans do not encounter nature as part of nature. There is an opposition between nature and human culture, what Levi-Strauss is calling culture. That is to say, and Levi-Strauss's key arguments is there are two very fundamental areas of human life where human beings are different from all other known living beings. One, human beings do not consume nature without the intervention of culture. And here, Levi-Strauss's fundamental observation is that all human societies, even the most primitive, have some form of cooking as understood widely, which is to say, even the most primitive human beings that we know do not simply eat or consume nature in the raw, right? They transform what they find in nature with the application of human agency or human processes of transforming nature. So either they apply heat to boil, to roast, to grill, okay? Or they will apply certain forms of what you might call um, rotting, right? You would allow that natural material. So it could be plants, it could be fish, it could be meat, to actually rot in a certain specific way before it is going to be eaten. So this is the crucial observation that Levi Strauss is making, that human beings consume nature. All living beings consume things from nature. So organic nature is consumed by living beings. But unlike all other living beings, human beings do not consume nature in the raw. They consume natural products after transforming them through what is a culturally mediated way. And the second observation is rules of kinship. That is to say, as far as sexual reproduction is concerned, unlike other living beings, which also reproduce sexually, human beings have specific rules about which sexual unions are permissible and which unions are not permissible. Okay, so even the most primitive societies that we know have rules of kinship, right? Whether this is actually a form of family or not, that's a different question. There are very specific ways in which we understand a family, and it's not necessarily the case that all human societies have that same understanding of family. But every human society, Levi Strauss is arguing, have specific rules by which certain kinds of sexual unions are not considered legitimate or permissible, and only some are. And these constitute the rules of kinship. Okay? Now, Levi Strauss also went on to make a very strong claim about the taboo on incest. And he claimed that all known human societies, even the most primitive and so on, all have certain prohibition on what is understood to be incestual relations. That is to say, relations between parents and their children, sexual relations between parents and their children, or between siblings. There is some kind of incest taboo, Levi Strauss claims. Now, that has been disputed. That is not necessarily the case. But it is undoubtedly true that all known human societies do have specific rules on which sexual unions are permissible and which not. Okay, and those define rules of kinship. So this is the basic approach that Levi Strauss is taking to the structural analysis of human society. We will, of course, look at only a very specific set of things that Levi Strauss proposes in this book, or at least in the first chapter of this book, which is really about thinking, the intellectual side of the human being. What is human thinking? And what does anthropology or the ethnography of primitive societies have to tell us about how human beings think? This is the crucial subject of this book. And remember, this is a book that Levi Strauss was writing for a wider readership. This is not a book addressed to other professional anthropologists. This is for a wider readership. And one of his intentions was to actually challenge the widespread prejudices in advanced industrial societies. And why only industrial societies? Even agrarian societies. You know, the widespread prejudices about so-called primitive, barbarian, forest-dwelling jungle people, right? And their barbaric ways and customs, and the widespread idea that primitive peoples are essentially stupid, that they have all these strange beliefs simply because they are ignorant and stupid. This is absolutely the central argument that Levi-Strauss is making in this book, is that primitive peoples are not stupid, that they have very, very sophisticated understanding, and he calls them intellectual or philosophical understanding of nature and the relations of human beings with nature, that these are extremely sophisticated forms of logical thinking, mind you. This is what he will analyze in this book. Okay, questions so far? So, so one of the first things that Levi-Strauss is arguing is that primitive people or primitive knowledge is not merely practical, although that is sometimes achieved as well. Now, this is aimed against what is largely known to be, and this used to be a very dominant form of analysis in anthropology. From the time of Durkheim and certainly into British social anthropology of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown and so on, who are the immediate predecessors of Levi-Strauss, known as functionalism, right? Adam Smith, too, you remember, had a certain functionalist understanding of pre-modern social practices. That argument, the functionalist argument, essentially worked like this: that, for instance, if you look at the myths of people, primitive peoples, which very often establish certain kinds of relations between natural objects like trees and rivers, water bodies, land, sacred spaces, etc., etc., and spiritual beings, right, and human beings in society, that there were all kinds of kinship relations established through these myths between natural objects and humans. And many of these would seem to us to be completely odd and bizarre, that the understanding that such and such a tree, if you belong to this clan, then such and such a tree is your ancestor, or such and such an animal is your ancestor. Now, obviously, it makes no sense for us to think of trees or animals as the ancestors of humans. But the structures of myths are exactly like that. Now, the functionalist explanation of this was that this is not meant to be a literal ascription of ancestry, in the physical sense. This is intended to establish and justify and implement a certain relation towards natural objects. So a certain relation, let us say, of kinship between certain kinds of trees or plants or water bodies and a particular human group, a clan, for instance, or even a family, or even individuals. And that relation is established because functionally that is the way in which those natural objects are preserved, right? That human beings take care of those natural objects which are important for the continued survival of that human group, of that social group. So it is to establish, so in a sense, the explanation is that functionalist explanation usually worked like this, to show how through these myths, certain kinds of ritual relations were established between human groups and natural bodies, right? And the effect was to establish relations by which natural bodies were preserved, protected by humans and not destroyed. Okay, there was certain kind of responsibility, just as one had responsibility towards one's kin, towards one's relatives. In a similar way, one had very similar relationships with nature, with natural objects too, through the establishment of these mythical kinship relations. That's the broad framework of functionalist explanation. Levi-Strauss is saying that that is not the primary role that myths play. The functional or the practical ends may sometimes be achieved, but that is not its purpose. The purpose is intellectual. Primitive people think complex thoughts, right? These primitive thought contains features that are common to all human thought. But this thinking is carried out through myths. This is his crucial framework, his crucial observation, and absolutely the fundamental of his method, that myths are ways of thinking logically, but through myths, unlike through concepts. He will make this distinction in a minute. We will talk about this, the distinction between mythical thinking or magical thinking and scientific or conceptual thinking. These are different. Okay, and it is because we try to look for conceptual thinking in primitive thought and we don't find it, and we think that primitive peoples are fools. What he's arguing is that primitive peoples also have extremely complex thoughts, but the way in which they think is through myths, not through concepts. Okay, and the whole approach of structural anthropology, Levi-Strauss's objective, was in fact to try and discover, just as you would do with a foreign language, right? Try and discover its underlying structure. Levi-Strauss is trying to understand the underlying structure of all primitive peoples, right? Their mythical thinking. So he will basically compile thousands of myths, stories of this kind, and try and do his structural analysis. This is what the 4 volumes of Mythologique consists of. We'll talk about how far he is actually successful in explaining myths. We'll come to that. That's a different question. But this is his basic approach or contention, right? That primitive people think through myths, not through concepts. So what's the distinction between magic and science, or myths and science? Magic claims a complete and all-embracing determinism. This is a very interesting claim that Levi-Strauss is making. We normally think of science as being determinist, right? Classical science is determinist. Levi-Strauss is saying quite the opposite. He is saying magic is what is completely determinist. Nothing escapes magical thinking, right? In other words, in magical thinking, where, once again, the basic operations are through mythical relations that are established between natural things, spiritual beings, and human beings. All of these things are related in all kinds of relations, relations of friendship, of love, of enmity, of some spirit, evil spirit, actually trying to harm a particular individual, other spirits which may come to its help, right? All of these become part of the magical thinking, the way in which, let's say, witch doctors would operate to cure somebody. So in this entire structure of mythical thinking, nothing escapes it, in the sense that any particular phenomenon or any particular situation which is confronted, mythical thinking or magical thinking will always have an answer for it. It is because of this. And as many of you know, I mean, there are dozens and dozens of stories that we have heard about this. When a particular remedy, for instance, which a magical practitioner, witch doctor or whatever, a particular remedy, a magical remedy, which is prescribed and it doesn't work, the explanation is always that it was not administered in the correct way. Some mistake was done, which is why it didn't work, right? Because the claim is that nothing can escape it. There is always a particular answer. There is a particular reason why something has happened, and there is a particular reason why something can be cured or something can be prevented. Okay, and if that remedy does not work, it is because of the fault of whoever was administering it. It was not done correctly. So it can never actually fail. That is the all-embracing determinism of magical claims. Science, on the other hand, it recognizes, as Levi-Strauss says, different levels and degrees of determinism. So as we know, science would say, well, this is the remedy for this particular illness, right? But it will say, and most of the time we know this, there is a 90% chance of curing. Now, that is not all-embracing determinism. It is recognizing that in 1 out of 100 cases, this remedy may fail. So that is a statistical way in which you express the degree of determinism. There is a determinism here, right? Likelihood of something working. But not everything works all the time. Yes, certain things we know will definitely work. You see, I throw up something in the air, it will fall down. Now that is 100% determinism. Right? We have no reason to believe why if it doesn't, if it flies off into the sky, well, we would say that's a miracle. But science does not admit of miracles. Okay? But there are lots of other things where science would say, well, we know, but we only know up to a degree. We don't know, we cannot predict with complete certainty. Right? And there are areas and phenomena which science will claim we cannot predict. So for instance, prediction of, we now know, for instance, with satellite imagery and so on and so forth, a lot of the weather predictions are fairly accurate now, okay? But on the other hand, things like predicting an earthquake, scientists will say, well, we simply cannot tell, right? All we can say is certain areas are prone to earthquakes, right? There is enough knowledge of, let us say, the faults in the geological structure, the underlying structure, and so on, which can lead to the probability that earthquakes will occur in this particular area. But when, at what intensity, these are not things which science actually knows, at least not as yet. Okay, so that is what Levi-Strauss, the distinction that Levi-Strauss is drawing. Mark very clearly, Levi-Strauss is not saying that myths or magical science is better than magical thought is better than science, or science is better than magic, right? These are, and this is Levi-Strauss's fundamental claim always, these are two different ways of thinking. These are two different ways of thinking, right? What is the distinction? There are distinctions. And one distinction is that myths claim to be completely deterministic. Nothing can escape it. Everything is within its purview. Magical thought is a well-articulated system, formally similar, but independent of science. Formally similar because, once again, its task is, its structure is logical, right? It tries, its attempt is to explain. Its attempt is also to intervene on the basis of that explanation. All of this is similar to science, but the two ways of thinking are completely separate, different. Magic and science are two parallel modes of acquiring knowledge. This is a very major claim that Levi-Strauss is making, which is in a sense to give to primitive peoples a status of, you might say, intellectual equality with advanced, so-called civilized people. Okay, this is Levi-Strauss's fun. If there is an ideological intention here, this is it, right? To argue with the broader public. Of course, he is addressing the Western literate public in a modern Western society, to say that primitive peoples also think exactly, do the same things in their thinking as we do, except that they do it through a completely different method. They are also acquiring knowledge, and they do have knowledge. And as we'll see in a minute, his claims about the kinds of knowledge that primitive peoples had, okay? But the methods of acquiring that knowledge was different. Questions? Now, yes, please.
Well, I was just asking if anyone has questions. So I do have a few, but I'm saving them for the end, really. So when you cover bricolage and other, so yeah, saving them for the end. Kind of, we'll link them all together. But if it...
Okay, so let's move on. So what is the kind of knowledge that primitive peoples had? And here, Levi-Strauss is referring to what is known as the Neolithic Revolution. The Neoliths are these small tools or implements from the megaliths, which are large tools by which primitive peoples hunted. And then you move to the neoliths, these smaller implements, which require a more advanced kind of control over natural objects like stones and so on, but also the early use of metal. So beginning from about 10,000 before the Common Era, that's to say about 12,000 years from now, behind us, right, in the past. This was the last part of the Stone Age, hence Neolithic, leading to the use of copper and iron, which would be the early Metal Ages, copper and iron. And this is the era, over several thousand years, the era of the invention of agriculture, the domestication of animals, and the making of pottery. These three absolutely central transitions in the early history of human society. Invention of agriculture, which, as you know, is a huge, enormous thing and completely transformed the nature of human society. So from hunting and hunting societies to actually cultivating, in other words, intervening in natural processes in order to cultivate specific plants that are of use to humans, okay? So that is the very, very big transition, the cultivation of various kinds of food grains, for instance. And then the domestication of animals, which is the side of the pastoral society, to turn wild animals into domesticated animals and essentially turn domesticated animals into a source of food. These all happened in this period. And the making of pottery, which is, of course, another very important stage in the making, right, in the artisanal side of human society, which is, take ordinary clay, right, and turn it through the use of fire into more lasting vessel, which would be used for a whole range of things. So this is the Neolithic revolution. In different phases, it doesn't occur at the same time everywhere, but and it occupies several thousand years. Neolithic knowledge, the knowledge of plants, animals, birds, and fishes, these were not the result of chance. Okay, all the knowledge that Neolithic peoples, these so-called early human societies, prehistoric human societies, their knowledge of plants, animals, birds, and fishes were not the result of chance. The Neolithic revolution started a long tradition of accumulation and transmitting knowledge. This is the crucial thing. That even if at some place some discovery was made by chance, that knowledge was accumulated and transmitted to future generations. So transmitted both to, over time, to the next generations, as well as transmitted from one people to another, laterally. Okay? How could this have been done without a systematic way in which that knowledge could have been, you might say, put together within a structure of thinking, right? It had to be done through a specialized language. Here, nature is known by perception and imagination, but it is through myths. It is through myths that this language, that this knowledge was codified, preserved, and transmitted from one generation to another, or from one people to another. Okay? That took place through the medium of myth. And here, once again, Levi-Strauss is emphasizing what science does in addition to this. Science moves one step away from this perceptual knowledge to build concepts. The crucial aspect of mythical thinking is that it does not rely on concepts. It does not rely on concepts. Concepts would require one to move one step away from the pure perceptual knowledge, knowledge that meets us in the eye, through touch, through smell, okay, all the physical perceptions, that is perceptual knowledge, which then through imagination is then transformed into mythical stories, narratives. That's the basic language. Science has to move away from that, from the pure perceptual language. There is, of course, a first step of perceptual language, but then it moves one step away to build concepts, right? And then scientific thinking works through the relation of concepts to concepts. It moves away from that perceptual layer of the basic information gathering or empirical knowledge. And here, Levi-Strauss brings in his very famous comparison with what in France used to be known as the bricoleur. I believe there are no bricoleurs anymore, but many of you would remember, there may still be people like this who we can encounter even now. These are people who would offer to, let us say, mend or repair anything that has gone wrong. It could be, pieces of furniture which they will repair. It could be instruments that they can repair. All kinds of things which they will repair or make based on a fixed set of tools which they always carry. Okay, so the key point of the bricolaur's technique is that whatever the task is in front of him, he will have to accomplish it through a combination of the tools that he already possesses. He cannot create or fabricate a new machine in order to meet that, in order to perform that task. Okay, so the bricolaur can perform a wide range of tasks with a limited number of heterogeneous tools, right? Then the tools can be a wide range of things. And very often these people will collect something from here. And if they would very often have a sack with, some of them are standard sort of handyman's tools, but they will have various pieces of wood, for instance, of different shapes and sizes, various pieces of metal, nails, screws, all sorts of things. And they would very often pick up things like that and add them to their toolkit. But any particular repair work or whatever that they are given, they will have to do them with the tools that they already possess. Okay, they will have to find some combination of things from out of their tool bag. Okay, the tools are accumulated from prior experience. They just may come in handy, which is the basic principle. But each tool can perform many and often unprecedented tasks. Okay, it's not that this tool is meant for this. That tool can be used for all sorts of things, things that may never have been done before. But it's, once again, with the same set of tools that he will have to do it. Elements of mythical thought lie between precepts and concepts. So, the bricolaur's tools are similar to the elements of myth. Myths are constructed out of elements. Okay, and these are a given set of elements, and any particular situation, any particular problem that is encountered will have to be explained or narrated, right, described with those given sets of mythical elements. The mythical elements is a set of things that are part of the inherited culture. Any new thing has to be explained with those given sets of things, right? the new phenomenon cannot produce a new set of concepts, which is how, for instance, scientists would often think. Very often, for instance, you may have heard this story of the arrival of the first sort of white men on a boat across the seas when they first come to America. And there are several stories of this kind of what various Native American peoples thought, how they explained this unprecedented thing. They had never seen people like this before. They'd never seen people who looked like this before. And for instance, one story is often told. I don't know whether it's actually some people actually had the story or whether it's been invented, but it's perfectly possible, where they explain this, people who come by sea, across the seas. And of course, for these Native American people, beyond the seas, there was no conception of other lands beyond the seas. Nobody has ever seen lands beyond the seas. So they thought that what lies beyond the sea is the sun, which of course comes up every morning from beyond the sea. So they immediately ascribed these people as those who lived in the land of the sun and who had arrived there. And of course, this was a way of essentially saying that the sun was part of their myths. It was an element. These people who arrived completely unprecedented, never seen before. How was one to explain the arrival of these people? They employ stories that are already there in the myth, in their myths, combine them differently in order to explain this new situation. This is essentially what Levi-Strauss is arguing, that it is like a language where words and grammatical rules are employed in new ways. It's the same stock of words and the same set of rules, but they can produce sentences that have never been written or spoken before. In the same way, myths occur in the same way. So, for instance, look at some of these examples. First, an example that primitive peoples can think intellectually, abstract thinking. So one of the standard understandings was primitive peoples cannot have abstract thought, right? They're incapable. This is confusing conceptual thinking with abstract thinking. It is not that primitive peoples cannot have abstract thoughts. For instance, he is giving the example of an American Indian, Native American, North American Chinook language, where, for instance, the sentence, which in English would be "the bad man killed the poor child," this would be spoken as "the man's badness killed the child's poverty." Now, badness and poverty are, of course, abstract. But what in English would never be understood as an abstract sentence, right, would be rendered this way in the Chinook language, because in that language, there is an abundance of abstract words. Okay, so it's not that primitive peoples cannot have abstract thinking. There's also many examples of how even in modern society, certain kinds of occupation, right, have much greater detailed divisions or classification among objects which ordinarily are not classified in that way. So, for instance, he spoke of that for a scientist, a in an observatory, okay, a scientist, a star is not simply a star, but the beta of Capricorn or the gamma of Centaur. So stars have a range of names and classifications that in ordinary language does not exist. And that is because, of course, it's the range of interest. Okay, it is the intensity of interest in particular objects, in particular occupation, right? So, for instance, he's also speaking of words. For instance, the description of horses, you know, in a racing stable. Okay, so they're not just horses; they have names, which ordinarily would make no sense to someone who is not involved in that occupation. Okay, so similarly, among primitive peoples, for instance, you say, you know, there are dozens and often hundreds of different classifications of, let's say, fishes and plants and so on, which ordinarily in modern society people may have no idea of the differences between those natural objects. They're all classed in one group, okay? This kind of fish or this kind of plant. But that plant in a primitive society may be actually distinguished between, you know, into 15 or 20 different varieties. All of them have different names, okay? So, for instance, among the Honono people of the Philippines, a custom as simple as that of beetle chewing demands a knowledge of 4 varieties of areca nut and 8 substitutes for them, and of 5 varieties of beetle and 5 substitutes. I'm sure many parts of India you have the same kinds of distinctions. So there are lots of examples of this. There is also the very interesting example that he gives about the determinism. So, for instance, the example is that in a particular village, there is a granary which is supported on columns, you know, of tree trunks, which are supporting that granary. And the anthropologist arrives there, and he notices that the tree trunks, there are termites which have eaten into the tree trunks. And then, while he's staying in that village, one day he is told that the granary has collapsed, and there was somebody sleeping under the granary, and that poor person was killed. So, and they were going to have a particular ceremony, a ritual, right, to placate the evil spirits which had done this, to kill this unfortunate person. So the anthropologist went and said, but you know, you already know that these trunks, these tree trunks that were supporting the granary, they had been eaten by termites. That could have fallen any time. So why do you think that this evil spirit had done this? So the answer was, well, of course we knew that, you know, they could have fallen any time, but why did it fall exactly when this man was sleeping under that granary? Now, look at what Levi-Strauss was claiming, the all-inclusive determinism of magical thinking, right? Any scientist or scientific way of thinking would have said that that granary was liable to collapse anytime, but no scientist would have said it would collapse exactly at that moment on that day. Science cannot predict that. But myth will insist that we can predict it and we can explain it. And it can only be, it is not to be explained by the brittle nature of the columns. It can only be explained by the intervention of this evil spirit who had done this in order to harm the individual. And of course, there would be stories about the relation between this evil spirit and this man, and why there should be this relation of enmity between them. So That is, of course, mythical thinking. So these are the kinds of things that Levi Strauss is pointing out, that the purpose of mythical thinking is actually to accumulate and transmit knowledge, right? And it's knowledge that is transmitted through the medium of myths rather than through concepts, which is what we will do in a scientific culture. Mythical elements function like linguistic signs. Okay, they are concrete images, but have wider powers of reference. Just as in language, for instance, we have letters. Letters are just signs, right? They are images. But each letter in an alphabet has a certain linguistic property. It has a sound when it's uttered. It can be combined. Combinations are happening to form words. The words will have, can be pronounced in a certain way, sounds. And then words combined, words with other words combined in a particular way, according to certain rules, will then have powers of reference to a wider world of meanings. Mythical elements function in the same way. So what Levi-Strauss is saying, that myths consist of elements. So these stories have elements out of which the stories are composed. The stories are like sentences or series of sentences, where these elements, mythical elements, are combined in particular ways to produce meanings, wider reference. Signs can be reorganized in different combinations, but within a closed system, which is the sign system or the linguistic system. Mythical thought is an intellectual form of bricolage. So just as the bricolayer, right, has this given set of tools, which it can combine in different ways with other things in order to produce some new thing, right, or repair old things, etc., etc. Mythical thought is an intellectual form of bricolage. It can only operate with those given things, those given elements, which can be combined and recombined in different ways to produce new meanings. What's the difference between myth and science? Concepts, unlike science, have unlimited powers of reference. Now, this is the key difference now. Myths are totally deterministic, but its signs, each sign has a limited set of references. So, for instance, you take a word like engineer, or you take a word like center. Okay, there are a set of meanings. You'll find it listed in a dictionary. Okay, it's not unlimited, but a concept like gravity, it can be applied anywhere. We say everything is under the, so any object, any structure that, for instance, an engineer encounters or even conceives of in the imagination, right? Things like gravity, things like weight, mass, right? All of those structural properties, conceptually, can refer to any range of things which already exist or which in fact do not exist. So, for instance, one of the key differences between the bricklayer and the engineer is that when the engineer is told, let us say, we need a bridge to be built here, right? The engineer, through conceptual thinking, will first design the bridge, look for appropriate material, if appropriate materials are not readily available, those materials will be found. Okay? If specific structures, if machines are not readily available, they can be fabricated. Okay? The entire structure is first laid out in the mind. You have very basic plans that engineers draw, okay, with as accurate as possible calculation, with specific materials, right? Their properties are known. That entire thing is first put down in design before the engineer actually mobilizes the material, the necessary machinery, and so on. The machinery is not readily there. The machinery can be brought. It can even be, as I said, fabricated for a particular purpose. That is possible because of conceptual thinking, which is not the way a bricklayer functions or the way in which primitive people will function. Concepts, unlike science, can open up a system to new worlds of meaning. Myth and science are not two stages. This is the crucial point, again, that Levi Strauss is making. Myth and science are not two stages of human thought. They are equally valid, but they serve different intellectual ends. Okay, their purpose, their objectives are different. Once again, mark this, Levi Strauss is insisting on a certain parity, on a certain recognition of equality between primitive thinking and scientific thinking. He is insisting that these are two different ways of doing essentially the same intellectual thing, which is knowledge, preserving knowledge, transmitting knowledge, but done very differently. He also has a very interesting comparison between myth and art. Myths are both systems of abstract relations and objects of aesthetic contemplation. So there is aesthetic contemplation too, which is possible through myths. Art is closer to myth than to science. Now, this is an interesting claim he's making, where he's saying that what modern humans do through art is actually closer to what myth will do. Professional art takes objects or events and reveals a common structure. Okay, and myth takes a structure and constructs objects and events. So what he's suggesting is that for professional art, for instance, and the example he gives, you will notice it. This is the painting that he has. He reproduces a much focused fragment of this painting in the book, which is focused on the lace collar of this dress that this lady is wearing, that laced the lace. And of course, this is a Dutch painting, or Flemish, I don't know, possibly Cuvier, I think. Here you will find a very, very detailed representation of the stitchwork of this lace, right? It's in the painting, right? It's not a photograph, a painting, but a very detailed stitchwork of this this lace, the lace work. So it's an object which it is made to reveal a common structure, which is the systematic arrangement of the threads stitch work, which reveals a particular pattern, which is what professional art will do. Myth will not do this. What myth will do is it will take the structure first. And out of that structure, an infinite number of objects or events can be produced. Right? It is that structural arrangement first, which is what the mythical objects and their relations will give. But out of that, events, objects, almost anything, even unprecedented events, can be fitted into that set of mythical objects, or some arrangement of the mythical objects can be made in order to go with this new event, which has never been seen before. That is what myths would do. Professional art internalizes execution or technique. So professional art, of course, as we all know, what is learned, what the professional artist learns is technique. How to use the tools and material, right, in or to produce, right, to execute this, to execute a particular piece of service, if it's sculpture or if it's painting, right, internalizes execution and purpose and externalizes the occasion, the object or event represented. The object of event that is represented is what will be shown. What is internal to the practice of the artist is the technique, right? The artist does not necessarily participate in the event or in the object itself, right? So, for instance, think of an artist who is representing, a ceremony, or representing a certain historical occasion, right? The storming of the Bastille. You have all these historical paintings, for instance, of that kind, or a painting of, let's say, a temple ceremony, something like that. Now, what is crucial is for the professional artist is the right technique, right? It is the technique which is internal to the practice. What it produces as the external object, the outcome, is a representation of that event. The artist does not participate. In fact, many often the artist never even witnessed that event, right? In primitive art, the occasion is what is internalized. So in primitive art, in fact, the production of the art itself is part of ritual, right? It is the timeless supernatural beings that exist everywhere. But externalizing the execution and purpose. The execution and purpose is what is produced, which is in the ritual itself. But the artist, the primitive artist, is a participant in the ritual, which is internal, right? It's internal to the practice of the primitive artist. Ritual practice is internal to his practice. This is the distinction that Levi-Strauss is trying to make. There's an interesting comparison that Levi-Strauss is making between games and ritual. Now, games are rule-bound performances, right? But very interestingly, and he gives this example of the New Guinea peoples who play football, who they've learned to play football from Australians, I suppose. Football is played, but the whole point of playing the football is that in the end, nobody must win. It is played repeatedly if needed so that neither side finally wins, even though they're playing this rule-bound game. Now, that, of course, is not the objective of the game as we know it. Okay, somebody must win. that is the whole point of playing the competitive game. Among Fox Indians, games are played between the living and the dead, but the dead must win. Now, all of this is to suggest that games in this, you could have something which looks like games, but if it is part of a mythical structure, right, then if it depends on the point of the ritual. Now, Levi-Strauss is not mentioning here, for instance, something like you have tribal conflicts. And tribal conflicts very often ends up in being ritualized games. It's like competition. So for instance, things like, you may have heard of headhunting. It used to be practiced once among the Nagas, for instance. And headhunting was competitive, right? Between two clans, for instance. It is competitive, and the idea was that somebody will win, or I have retaliated, I have exceeded you. So it depends on the point of the ritual. If the point of the ritual is in fact enmity or hostility, which can also be the case, it's not necessarily always friendly and pacific and establish some kind of harmony. Although that can also happen. So Levi-Strauss is citing here the harmonious part, ritual part of many of these peoples. The Fox Indians, games are played between living and the dead. But there, his argument is that the dead are in fact pacified through this not very sincere acceptance that the dead have won the game. Okay, they are, in a sense, the ancestors are pacified that way. That is the point of the ritual. And so the rule-bound game is mobilized in order to produce that outcome. Games distinguish between winners and losers and create inequality, which is what games will do in our society. Rituals conjoin unequal parts by allowing all to join the winning side. Now, this, of course, is Levi-Strauss's way of showing in some ways that, in fact, primitive peoples often manage to do similar things that we do, but for purposes that Levi-Strauss is suggesting here are, in a sense, better than what modern people do. Now, Levi-Strauss's structural anthropology has come under a lot of criticism, especially in the last 40 or 50 years. And the main problem, there are many, including people have contested his specific analysis of myths of particular societies, particular peoples. Because, as I said, that Levi-Strauss himself did not carry out any fieldwork of the material. The material he deals with is not the result of his own fieldwork. He's simply relying on accounts by others, and many of these accounts have later been shown to be imprecise, incorrect, not the result of accurate observation. And so many of those errors have crept into Levi-Strauss's own explanations of specific myths of specific peoples. People have shown this. But more generally, the difficulty with the structural method or structuralist method is how to explain historical change. This becomes, and Levi-Strauss engaged in several debates over this. There is a famous debate. In fact, in this book, towards the end, there is an exchange with Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre, of course, was a Marxist, and he questioned Levi-Strauss's method, basically to argue that you cannot explain historical change. with your method. The structure is defined in a state of synchrony. As I said, the structure, the mythical structure, is essentially a synchronic structure, right? There are elements, the elements have specific relations between them. They can be arranged and rearranged, right? But always in a structural, in a synchronic state, right? The difficulty is, how can one identify and explain changes in a structure over time? So primitive peoples, for instance, the mythical structures and so on, anything that changes, Levi-Strauss's claim would be, these can all be explained within that given set of mythical elements. Those mythical elements are rearranged to produce all of these new outcomes. Nothing changes in the structure itself, because that structure is defined in synchrony. They all exist simultaneously at the same time. Now, how can you explain if, for instance, you are suggesting or trying to understand the change that takes place in some primitive society over time, right? People's rituals change, their beliefs may change. Would you be able to explain this using Levi-Strauss's method? Levi-Strauss insisted that the synchronic study of structure and the diachronic study of historical change were two ways of doing the same thing. This is what comes out every time in that exchange with Sartre, for instance. If you look at this book and the chapters at the end, this is what would come out. But others have disputed. Althusser, for instance, attempted to use the structural method to explain change within a Marxist framework of history, where, of course, the crucial point was to explain change. So, for instance, feudalism, you can give feudalism a structural description, a specific structural description of the relations between lords and serfs, for instance, the particular ways in which their relations are structured, what is the way in which production is carried out, what is the way in which the surplus is transferred from the producer, serf or peasant or tenant to the landlord, through the form of rent and so on and so forth. You can give a structural description. But when you have a historical account of the change of that feudal structure into an industrial capitalist society, that same society has changed. Can you explain this through a structural method? Okay. In other words, can you explain from within your structural account of feudalism its change into a different structure of capitalist society? Can you do this? This becomes the key problem, right? Even Althusser's method has been suggested that he is unable to do this. And the problem, obviously, is how you explain what in the Marxist terminology has often been called the transition from a feudal structure of society to, let us say, a capitalist structure of society. Can you explain this transition itself from within the synchronic description of a structure? How can you do that? So we will see, for instance, Michel Foucault, who will attempt to go beyond this structural method by using what he would call the methods of archaeology, right? Where synchronically at the same time, you can find in an archaeological site, for instance, when they do excavations, digging, right? Different layers show the remains at this time simultaneously, remains of different periods of time. You can see that simultaneously in an archaeological site. What Foucault is suggesting that you could apply this to modern society and actually try and discover how the remnants or layers or sediments of earlier formations still lie, right, beneath the surface of modern industrial society. Can you find them? That is the archaeological method. And the genealogical method, genealogy, that is moving from one generation to the next, right? And it branches off, and you know, genealogical trees, it branches off. And that is another method whereby you can show how from one source or root, okay, several branches were possible. But not all branches or not all those branches were necessarily the roots taken. Only one was taken. The others were still there and could have been taken, but that didn't. And that becomes a point of historical explanation as to why out of 2 or 3 or several possible outcomes or lines of development, only one was chosen. Okay, and that would have to be a very contextual description. So that would be the genealogical method. So Foucault would attempt this, and we will see some of this next time in the last 3 lectures. We'll have some exposure to Foucault's method. Very often that has been called a post-structuralist method. Foucault himself didn't like that term, but nevertheless, you can see that he is clearly trying to move beyond this trap of being unable to reconcile synchrony and diachrony within the same method. Okay, so let me stop here, and I can take some questions.
Questions? I will ask mine before. So I'll just start off with more questions while you think of questions, right? Partha, this is, I mean, kind of a curious question thing, but I've always wondered about this North Indian concept of jugaad.
Of jugaad. Yes, yes.
Do you think that Levi-Strauss's bricolage kind of, or bricolage corresponds to the sense of jugaad at all? Kind of, are you looking at it because it's now being employed in all of this management and space?
Yeah. Yeah, in some ways it is true. And the whole idea of, and in fact, that is very often how this idea has been generalized to say that what actually prevailed in a pre-industrial culture gets deployed even within occupations today which are very industrial. So for instance, you will find in a modern factory sometimes, and certainly if you think of the operation of completely modern machine, like for instance a motor car or a truck, right? And the way in which, for instance, in our cultures, even urban cultures, the way in which, for instance, a motor mechanic will repair a car in our cultures. How, for instance, the truck drivers will very often, fix the machine. And you can see even for the way in which the operations like, machines like the auto rickshaw today, or even more, the Toto, for instance, completely, fabricated, not as an industrial product at all. And yet all of its components, it operates with a battery or with a petroleum motor. All of that And yet, you might say it's from a prior given set of materials, right, which were already known and whose properties and uses and multifarious uses were known, right? That gets deployed, even though within any engineer would say this is rubbish. Why you're actually destroying the machine. But in a sense, the machine keeps, is kept in a certain kind of working condition through the application of what essentially Levi Strauss would call the operations of bricolage, right? It is, and the knowledge, and very often you actually, if you think of it, this has been remarked on in a lot of cases, the way in which people who operate with machines, they are not engineers, right? They do not necessarily think conceptually. In fact, they do not think conceptually. Many of them may be completely unlettered people. And yet they are often, you will notice this, in modern industrial establishments, you will find the operation of these mysteries, essentially, who are often, engineers will rely on them for they will say this is their native knowledge. They know these machines in a sense much better than we do. But what does it mean to say that they know them? They don't know them in the same way that an engineer knows, right? So what is the mental map in which our mysteries operate? They operate with very modern machines too, but they do not think of them conceptually. And very often, as we know, they have completely different kinds of names for many of the things where engineers use other names, right? They don't necessarily use those same names, but they have a way of thinking. They have a set of knowledge which is transmitted from one generation to another. New people who come into that line of occupation learn those techniques and those terms, right? In the way in which apprentices would have learned an earlier craft, right? So this is the interesting, in a sense, what Levi Strauss is suggesting, that if you were to actually investigate the mental world of these people who practice jugaad, right, you will probably find precisely this way of thinking. How do they codify, preserve, and transmit this knowledge, right? Which is not in the form of the knowledge of the engineer or the scientist, but they're using the same things. They are facing, in a sense, the same problems, right? How do you repair a machine which is not working?
In that sense, is kind of bricolage supplementing science, or supplement is kind of.
Now we would think of it as supplementing, of course, because we think of science as the basic way in which it has to be done, right?
Yeah.
What Levi Strauss is saying, why don't we invert this,
Yes.
right? And go back to let us say most people were not scientists, right? And yet I sometimes think of the way in which people operate with mobile phones these days, right? And the question you can ask is the way in which ordinary people, many of whom may not have even literacy, how do they operate the mobile phone? Do they actually regard it in the same way that we do? Or is there a very different way in which they conceive of that phone and that instrument, and how to, in other words, there is a completely different map in their minds, right?
I think the definition of science that Levi-Strauss kind of, because maybe this also is science, really.
Yeah. Sure. No, but sometimes, for instance, I've often got into conversations with taxi drivers and so on and try to understand how they navigate. We have a map. For instance, we move around in the city of Calcutta. we actually think of it in terms of a map, right? North, south, we know exactly which direction something is. And when something does not fit into it, we get lost, right? Now, how do taxi drivers operate? And the way I've often got into conversations with them, and it's very clear they do not operate with the kind of map that we do. They have a very different, and I have not been able to understand it, how they do it, right? But of course, they know their way. But how do they find their way? It is not a concept, it's not a cartographic map. It's
something, or this is.
Yeah, I have, I have tried to, very often, the way they look for particular signs. They, you have, this shop there, that building there, you turn right there. But there is no understanding that turning right means you're going east of something or north of something. That is not how it operates. I still don't know how it happens, because it's a completely, you'd have to do the kind of ethnography that Levi Strauss is recommending in order to discover this. But that is an interesting question. It's non-conceptual thinking.
If someone else wants to go before me, please. I mean, I have many questions that I can ask Partha as well. Okay, so Rajesh, has questions. Rajesh, do you want to read them yourself, or are you having problems with your audio? Okay, I'll read them for you, Partha, because question. One is, does structuralism in any form share a genealogical affinity to Enlightenment notions of universality?
Structuralism share a genealogical, what is it?
Enlightenment notions of universalism.
Now, I don't know whether it is genealogical. I mean, we'll have to think about that. It is certainly claiming universality. What it is claiming is, or Levi Strauss, I mean, generally speaking, all of structural linguistics too, they are all attempting to find some universal common elements, structural elements, out of which all languages, for instance, in the case of linguistics, all languages, the claim is, share certain basic universal structural forms. They all have these rules of, long and parole. They have rules, the syntactic and semantic rules. You then go into sound, into phonetic. All the ways in which phonetic structures develop in different languages. They can all be described in terms of certain very fundamental set of elements. And there are a set of, a small number of elements which can be combined in different ways to produce different linguistic outcomes, languages, in fact. Similarly, Levi Strauss is claiming that myths have, and this is what he was trying to do in the entire 4 volumes of mythologies, to reduce all known myths to a set of basic elements, structural elements, which can be combined. He was doing the same thing for kinship, for instance. Of course, there's a whole variety of kinship rules that one finds in different societies. He was trying to reduce them, all of them, to certain basic structural elements, which can be combined in different ways to produce all of these different specific kinship structures. Same with myths generally. Is this an enlightenment? You see, one very interesting thing here, and this is the contrast he is drawing. The Enlightenment idea of rationality, of course, puts the premium on conceptual thinking. That is what reason is supposed to be. Reason is not purely empirical. Reason necessarily means reflecting on the perceptual knowledge, which is the empirical, daily knowledge of experience. But reason is at one remove from experience. And that is what rational knowledge is, which is science. That is the major contribution, you might say, of Enlightenment thinking. That kind of scientific rational knowledge is what is, you might even say, at the top of the hierarchy of all kinds of knowledges. Yes, there are all sorts of practical knowledges too. So, for instance, if you follow Enlightenment knowledge, you would say that there are lots of, systems of healing or systems of medicine in different pre-modern cultures. And they may all have their uses, right? They may all contain elements of true knowledge. But if they are recognized by rational science as having those true properties, they become incorporated into modern scientific knowledge. So, for instance, if in a particular, local practice, certain plants or certain metals are believed to have particular healing properties, and they are practiced that way. If in fact a modern scientist were to actually study those plants, he may well be able to discover what that healing property is, what that specific quality is. And in fact, as we know, many of the modern medicines actually have grown out of the knowledge of prior medical systems, right? Of the knowledge of particular plants and so on. Then it becomes incorporated into the conceptual knowledge of science, right? But the other knowledges may still exist or continue to exist as sort of subordinate or inferior forms of knowledge. A kind of hierarchy is there. What Levi-Strauss is challenging is this hierarchy. Levi-Strauss is challenging the idea that civilized people with their scientific knowledge have arrived at a kind of way of thinking, right, which is intellectually superior to the ways of thinking of primitive people. This is which again is very much a part of Enlightenment thinking. So Enlightenment thinking does make this distinction, it has always made this distinction between the civilized and the barbaric, the civilized and the savage, right? And this is the hierarchy, the relation of superior and inferior that Levi-Strauss is trying to challenge, particularly in this, this more general book addressed to a wider public. Yes.
Partha, I think his next question is something that you have addressed already, but I'll read it out nevertheless. It's considering that Levi-Strauss posits that primitive thought possesses logic. Is there any place for reason as such in magical or mythical thinking, or does reason fall only within the ambit of scientific or conceptual thinking?
You see, it depends on what you mean by reason. If, as I just explained, if by reason, which is the whole Enlightenment understanding of reason or rationality as essentially conceptual thinking, then this is what Levi-Strauss is saying. This is not what mythical thinking does. Mythical thinking does not proceed through concepts, right? It proceeds through these objects, right, which are put in particular relations structurally within a mythical system, and it operates through narratives or stories. So stories relate one thing to another thing. These relations are what is crucial in terms of the range of meanings that may be possible. Okay, but this is not what conceptual thinking does. It's that, that's a very different way of thinking. What Levi-Strauss is clearly challenging is the denial of any kind of intellectual merit to primitive forms of thinking, and basically saying they are doing the same thing as we do. They are also acquiring knowledge, they are codifying knowledge, they are transmitting knowledge from one generation to another, except they are doing this in the form of mythical stories rather than in the form of conceptual relations.
Also, what we, yeah. So the name of the title of the first chapter is The Science of the Concrete.
Yes.
So
Yes.
yeah, actually I wanted to know the
This
what
is concrete as distinct from abstract concepts, right?
okay.
Concrete as the opposite of abstract concepts. So it's not, so for instance, there is no concept of gravity. There, which is, so gravity is not about any concrete thing. Gravity is supposed to be a force that is universal. Any object, every object is subject to that force, right? So that is not concrete. What is concrete is you take an object and you drop it, it falls. Now that is a concrete observation. It's a concrete event. Okay. What Levi-Strauss is suggesting is that there is, see, our understanding of science is not out of the concrete. You remove yourself, you move one step beyond the concrete, you abstract out of the concrete, okay, and you form concepts which can relate to any number of things, an unlimited range of things, but it is defined conceptually. Gravity can actually operate on an unlimited number of objects, specific objects, right? So somebody falls off the roof of a building, and we say, "Oh, that person has died by accident." That is an event, but it is explained by gravity. It is explained again by gravity. So the conceptual thinking can include or explain an unlimited range of events, but the concrete is a concrete event. Okay, so and so was had a certain, some event with some spirit. So and so was born from a tree. Okay, so and so was found in a river. Now that is an event, but that produces a range of mythical stories, right? Think of any of our myths. Look back on the Puranas or even in the Mahabharata. The stories of the birth of various people. Many of them are strange, right? Unnatural births. Those are mythical, those are events, those are concrete events. What the challenge of that title of the chapter is to say that you can have a science too built out of concrete events, right? And this is what Levi-Strauss is trying to persuade his reader.
So
that
here,
this is a,
so here concrete is not empirical.
well, it is empirical in the sense it is actual events, a series of events, right? Which you perceive. They are perceived events. They can be perceived things also, objects. So it is empirical. But you see, when we say empirical, we usually think of it in this relation with the conceptual, right? With the abstract, because that is how we've been used to. So we think of the empirical as confirming a theory, for instance. Or we collect a range of empirical observations and try to build a theory, which is an abstract out of it. Okay, Levi-Strauss would say, no, that is not how the primitive person thinks. The primitive person will not move out of abstract, out of empirical observation. those empirical observations, so-and-so was born, so-and-so was named, so-and-so had a fight with somebody, so-and-so married somebody. All of these things are empirical. Okay, but they are brought into combination through story. Okay, which will give the possibility of new events to be explained with those sets of elements. And that is what Levi-Strauss is claiming. Of course, it is not, of course, there is once again a play on the word science, because he is already saying that what they're doing is not science. Science does something else. But it is as though they are doing the same things that science is also trying to do, but in a different way.
Yeah, then would he suggest that that myth making is a kind of a process of trying to generalize some events? Generalization.
This is the interesting question. You see, when we say generalized events, we are saying that the events are superseded by some general observation, right? What Levi-Strauss would say, no, some general observation is explained through new sets of events. Events are combined differently. So, for instance, exactly this example that I gave you of this completely unprecedented kinds of white people who are emerging from the sea. Now, they have never seen this. This is an event. This is an event. But how would you explain this? Now, they will explain it in terms of other events that they already have seen or know, which is codified in their knowledge in the form of myths. So they will go back to those where there is a sun, there is a sea, right? There are people who may be living there. All of those things are possible. And that is combined in a way, right, to explain this event. Now, this is not conceptual. This is not conceptual.
But
So
then when another set of people would arrive, then what would they do?
What would
they do?
Another set of white people arrive.
Shobita?
No, so over time, I'm sure. So this is the first arrival, which they explain this way, right? And over time, they will probably, depending on what kind of relation they establish with the white people, it may be friendly relations, it may be hostile relations, right? And all of those friendly events or hostile acts will then be explained in terms of the already known relation between the sun, some people of the sun, and our peoples. There will be other stories which will then be mobilized to explain why these people who are arriving, or the further white people who are arriving, right? They will continue to arrive from the sun. Okay, but are they friendly? Are they hostile? All of that will then be explained in terms of those kinds of stories. You could even think of the strange behavior of these white people. Obviously, they will behave in ways which will be different, right? But that again will be explained, made sense of.
Causally.
True?
With causality.
Yes. So now the important question that you can then be pushed into asking is, after several generations, for instance, right? When, as we all know, the Native American people learned the languages of the conquerors, they may even adopt the Christian faith. All right, what happens then? And now that is the kind of problem that Levi-Strauss's structural anthropology will find difficult to explain. Because there will be lots of later ethnographies of, the people of the Americas in more recent times. Okay, where you will have, they are Christian. But even in their Christian practices, they do not understand the Christian practices in the same way that the European Christian theologians understand it. Now, that becomes a new kind of problem. is it to be understood simply in terms of an already given mythical structure, right? Which is simply accommodating various Christian ideas and practices and stuffing them into that old structure, or has the old structure itself changed? Now, that is the kind of diachronic problem which Levi-Strauss's method will find it difficult to explain.
But we are talking about Levi-Strauss, but as Levi-Strauss is saying that he's taking the basic format from Saussure itself. So Saussure
From
also,
linguistics, broadly linguistics, yes.
yeah,
Jakobson, more.
yeah. He writes about that of Saussure, that but Saussure himself, he kept aside these two things, diachrony and the idea of
Absolutely.
parole.
Absolutely.
Then the problem would be of structural linguistics itself.
That is true. That is true. So, if what explains changes within a linguistic structure, that is a problem that, structural linguistics has also faced. Sure. And that is the kind of problem later, for instance, that post-structuralism and so on will say, you cannot do it within structural anthropology. That
So having the transcendental signified that the structuralists rely on, that there is the one signified which actually means something, which there is a kind of contest, right? Because they argue that they cannot be a transcendental signified in itself. But I was also thinking that with Levi-Strauss's kind of the way he looks at myths, there is a lot of similarity with Vladimir Prop and how he looks at the morphology.
Prop, yes, sure. I mean, that has been argued. Although, many people would say, I mean, I don't know if Levi-Strauss has ever actually discussed Prop's formalism directly. He may have, but the argument would be that I think that method-wise, it's very much the same argument. It's very much the same argument, except I think Levi-Strauss would claim that Prop actually restricts the range of meanings that are possible, because Prop very much argues that there are only something like 32 stories that are possible. All folk tales are basically variations on these 32 stories, or whatever number. I think Levi-Strauss would certainly say no. That in fact, he would say there is an unlimited number of stories that are possible by combining and recombining these elements of meaning.
There is another question, Partha, which is again Rajarshi, and he says that so in primitive thinking, the story itself becomes the truth.
Becomes the
truth.
Well, see, once again, it is not just one story. You see, this is the claim that Levi-Strauss is making, that unlike concepts, right, which will have an unlimited range, but the concept itself is very clearly defined with specific application, right? But stories have this property that it can be transformed from, since these elements can be combined and recombined, one story can give rise to an infinite number of new stories. And that is why, when you say truth, you see, this is the interesting question. I don't know what Levi-Strauss often had this problem with the use of the word truth here, because his argument would be, he is much more comfortable using the word knowledge, because there is knowledge. And because truth also has this, especially in scientific truth, that it must be corroborated by actual experience. So basically, when you say a scientific theory, which is put in abstract conceptual terms, right, But a scientific theory is supposed to have become acceptable as true only when it is confirmed by experiments or empirical observation. Only when it is confirmed do you say that, or would scientists say, yes, we now have a true theory. In the case of primitive thought, that is not the form of confirmation of truth, right? It is, once again, because it is not conceptual. So you do not first advance a conceptual hypothesis or theory and then have it confirmed by actual observation. It remains within at the perceptual level all the way through. It does not move away from the perceptual level into the level of concepts. So it is, as I say, percepts. So perceptual knowledge is the level where various relations are established between what is perceived, all the elements of what is perceived, right? They are combined and recombined in order to account for or explain new things. All right, then. So we can meet next week. We will meet in class, in person.
What, so would it be from 11:30 or 12?
11:30 is fine. So 11:30 to 1:30. After that, you will get hungry.
So 3 lectures on Foucault to come.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Partha.
Thank you.
I'm stopping the recording.